The night burned red. Flames licked the edge of the horizon as Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, stood upon her crumbling ramparts and watched the Roman Ninth Legion march through the smoke. The roar of battle had faded, replaced by the crackle of fire and the rhythm of iron boots. The air stank of blood, ash, and the death of her people. Her husband's banner, once gold and proud, lay twisted in the mud, crushed beneath a Roman standard crowned with the eagle. Below her, the screams of villagers rose and fell like waves, then vanished into silence. For a moment, she could almost believe the gods themselves had abandoned Britain. Cartimandua had ruled from coast to coast. Her word had been law, her warriors fierce as wolves, her will unbreakable. Yet now, as the red-cloaked soldiers scaled the hill toward her palace, all that power meant nothing. She had lost her kingdom. Her husband. Her gods. And soon, her name. When the centurion entered the hall, she expected the blade. Death, at least, would be honorable. But Rome had no interest in honor. The queen of the Brigantes, he said, almost tenderly, as though naming a specimen. Then, with quiet precision, he took her crown from her head. Rome doesn't destroy queens, he murmured. It redefines them. That sentence cut deeper than any sword. For Rome had discovered that killing a ruler made her a martyr. But breaking her, slowly, methodically, made her a weapon. Bound in gold chains, Cartimandua was led through the ruins of her own hall. Every torch illuminated another fallen banner, another shattered relic of her reign. Outside, the night wind carried the scent of burning oak and the faint echo of prayers, her people's last defiance. The soldiers treated her gently, almost reverently, as they would a sacred offering. But she knew what this meant. Rome didn't preserve beauty, it repurposed it. Her survival was not a mercy. It was the beginning of a process older than mercy and colder than war. As the legions marched her away, the horizon glowed with fire. Somewhere behind her, the fortress that had once been her world collapsed into smoke. Cartimandua did not weep. She only whispered to herself, voice trembling but unbroken. You may take my crown. But my spirit. A soldier struck her across the face before she could finish. That night, beneath a sky the color of blood, the queen of the Brigantes began her descent, not into death, but into something far worse, Rome's art of breaking the human soul. The Romans did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as engineers. To them, the human mind was simply another frontier to conquer, a fortress of will that could be measured, breached, and rebuilt in Rome's image. Cartimandua's capture was recorded in the military archives as Operation Dignitas Destituta. To the Romans, it was not a tragedy. It was data. Every movement she made, every silence she kept, was noted by men in crimson cloaks carrying wax tablets. She was no longer a queen. She was a case study. In a chamber beneath the fortress, Roman scribes stood before maps of Europe marked with tribal emblems. Lines of ink connected them like veins on a living body, a circulatory system of obedience. At the center, the symbol of Rome pulsed like a heart made of iron. The empire's philosophers, once students of virtue, now spoke the language of control. They dissected culture like anatomy. They identified what people loved, what they feared, what gave them the illusion of freedom, and then turned those very things against them. Every spirit has a hinge, wrote one scholar. Break it cleanly, and the body will follow. Cartimandua was brought into a hall lined with bronze masks, the faces of former rulers who had once resisted Rome. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths fixed in eternal silence. A Roman official approached her, scroll in hand, reading from what sounded like scripture but was, in truth, a manual. To destroy resistance, one must not end life, one must erase the concept of resistance. The words echoed off the marble walls. She understood none of the Latin, yet she felt the meaning in her bones. Rome's brilliance was its precision. Celtic queens, proud in their defiance, were isolated until pride turned to madness. Germanic princesses, raised in loyalty, were forced to witness betrayal staged by Roman actors. Egyptian royals, born believing they were divine, were made to scrub temple floors until divinity became a joke. Each cruelty was tailored, tested, and improved. It was not hatred, it was process. That night, as Cartimandua sat in her cell beneath flickering torchlight, she heard the distant hum of quills scratching wax, the sound of men turning agony into policy. Rome did not torture for pleasure. It tortured for order. And in that silence between screams, the queen began to realize, she was not being punished. She was being rewritten. The ritual began in silence. No screaming, no violence, only the sound of cataloging. When Cartimandua crossed the threshold of the Roman camp, she expected interrogation. Instead, she found a table lined with her life. Her crown. Her bracelets. The necklace her mother had clasped around her neck the day she became queen. Every piece of her past was laid out like evidence in a trial she did not understand. The Roman interrogators were not brutes. They were scholars wearing crimson and gold, their fingers stained with ink instead of blood. They asked her questions with perfect politeness. Who gave you this? What does this symbol mean? What did you feel when you wore it? They wrote down every answer. And they smiled, not in cruelty, but in satisfaction. The next morning, a young translator entered her tent, pale and trembling. He carried a parchment stamped with the imperial seal. His voice broke as he read aloud. Your crown has been melted down into a chamber pot for the barracks of the 10th Legion. Your wedding bracelet has been gifted to a registered prostitute in the Forum. Your mother's necklace has been exchanged for ink used in record-keeping. Cartimandua felt her breath leave her chest. This was not punishment. It was precision. Rome understood that the fastest way to break a spirit was not to destroy what she loved, but to reassign its meaning. The items weren't stolen. They had been transformed. Desecrated by bureaucracy. Then came the hair. Celtic queens wore their braids as a sacred connection to the ancestors, threads that symbolized lineage and divine favor. 2 soldiers held her shoulders while a Roman matron, wearing gloves of gold thread, cut through the braids one by one. Each severed strand fell like the execution of a memory. When the last lock hit the ground, they fitted her with a Roman wig, smooth, perfumed, false. It was beautiful, perfect, soulless. They stood her before a polished bronze mirror. For a long time, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The reflection had her eyes, but not her life. The Romans watched her reaction carefully, taking notes on wax tablets. Subject demonstrates cognitive dissonance, one wrote. Resistance weakening. Cartimandua reached toward the mirror, trembling. Her fingertips met the cold bronze surface, and she realized that the stranger inside was exactly what Rome wanted her to become. A queen without a name. A symbol without a soul. A body that once held a kingdom, now hollowed, catalogued, and repurposed. The journey began before dawn. The sky was still gray when the soldiers lifted the silk-draped litter and began their march. From afar, it looked ceremonial, elegant even. But the silence of the crowd told a different story. The queen sat within, wrapped in white fabric that glowed faintly through the veil. The gold embroidery caught the light like fire, but to those watching, she was not a ruler. She was a warning. Every mile of the route was planned with military precision. The litter moved slowly through conquered villages, past burned fields and rebuilt roads paved with Roman order. Mothers pulled their daughters close and whispered, "Defy Rome, and you will join her." Children stared in terrified wonder. The soldiers kept their gaze forward, disciplined, unfeeling. For 3 days, Cartimandua said nothing. She barely blinked. The Romans mistook her silence for serenity. In truth, it was armor, thin and cracking, but armor nonetheless. Inside, her mind burned with a cold, precise fury. When they crossed into Italy, the air changed. The smell of smoke and soil gave way to marble dust and incense. Musicians played soft flutes as her litter entered the gates of Rome, and petals fell from balconies like snow. The people cheered, believing they witnessed a royal ally visiting their empire. None knew she was a captive. None needed to. Her villa awaited on the outskirts, a mansion built not for punishment, but for display. Columns carved with laurel crowns. Fountains singing with imported water. Servants waiting with measured smiles. It was paradise engineered as a prison. Cartimandua stepped onto polished marble floors that mirrored her bare feet. The walls were painted with scenes of harmony and divine favor, lies preserved in pigment. Every servant who bowed to her was an informant. Every word she spoke was recorded. Every gesture was interpreted for signs of rebellion or acceptance. Her meals were exquisite, her bath perfumed, her bed soft enough to cradle a goddess, and she hated all of it. For she understood the genius behind it, pain inspired resistance, but comfort bred surrender. Rome had learned that chains were most effective when they glittered. That night, as torches flickered in the courtyard, Cartimandua stood at her balcony overlooking the city that had devoured the world. Somewhere beneath the noise of fountains and laughter, she could almost hear the echo of Celtic drums, distant, dying. And for the first time, she felt the weight of Rome not as an empire of soldiers, but as a system of smiles. A golden cage, polished and perfect, waiting for its prisoner to believe she was free. The villa smelled of roses and ink. Soft music drifted from a distant courtyard, but beneath the sound of harps lay something mechanical, the constant scratching of quills on parchment. Cartimandua was told she was free to walk the gardens, to eat when she pleased, to read the texts chosen for her by Rome's finest scholars. But freedom, she soon learned, was just another form of calculation. Every step she took echoed in corridors lined with watchers pretending not to watch. Every sigh was recorded. Every word, weighed and dissected like an insect beneath glass. Her attendants smiled with perfect grace. The cook who seasoned her meals, the maid who brushed her hair, the musician who played the lyre outside her window, all of them reported to the same department, Custodia Mentis, the custody of the mind. Among them was Brigantia, a Germanic princess with calm blue eyes and a voice as gentle as winter snow. She told Cartimandua that resistance was noble but useless. "They will break you either way," she whispered one night, their hands touching in the lamplight. "Better to survive." Cartimandua believed her. Brigantia seemed genuine, a fellow captive, a soul scarred by Rome's cruelty. Yet each conversation was an experiment. Behind the walls, scribes transcribed their words, noting inflection, hesitation, tone. Brigantia was no prisoner. She was Rome's creation, a living instrument of empathy turned inside out. The empire had discovered something terrifying, that fear only hardens resolve, but trust dissolves it. The trick was not to frighten the human heart, but to rewrite it. Every day, Cartimandua received letters, false ones, supposedly from distant tribes. Some promised rescue. Others confessed betrayal. She never knew which to believe. Slowly, her memories of loyalty and faith began to unravel, replaced by the sterile calm of survival. 6 months later, the reports in the archives read: Subject displays reduced inquiry regarding external rescue. Demonstrates willingness to engage in civil discourse. Compliance index, 71%. By the end of the year, she was providing advice on managing Celtic resistance. Her insights were methodically copied, distributed, and studied across the empire. One night, Brigantia embraced her softly. "You've adapted," she murmured. "That's strength." But when Brigantia left the room, Cartimandua caught sight of her reflection in the mirror, serene, composed, obedient, and something in her chest twisted. Because for the first time, she couldn't tell whether the woman in the mirror was her, or the version Rome had created. By 50 CE, Rome no longer fought wars with swords alone. It fought with systems. The empire had turned submission into an industry, a perfect machinery of obedience. Every province, from Britain to Syria, followed the same manuals, step-by-step instructions for breaking the human spirit. Governors sent monthly reports to the capital, carefully noting statistics, number of captives processed, rate of emotional surrender, duration of resistance. Human suffering was no longer a tragedy, it was a metric. In the archives of Alexandria, beneath the marble floors of the library, a secret symposium convened. The finest administrators, philosophers, and military scholars gathered under torchlight, not to discuss virtue or philosophy, but to compare results. On a massive wax tablet, the figures glowed red in the lamplight. Celtic subjects, 23% faster compliance using false hope letters. Germanic subjects, 17% improvement through staged betrayal. Egyptian royalty, 31% success using divine negation rituals. Each statistic represented broken souls, and yet the scholars applauded as if hearing music. Rome had learned the rhythm of human despair. The system spread across 3 continents. Governors competed for efficiency awards, rewarded with gold and titles for discovering faster ways to extinguish defiance. Philosophers wrote essays on the virtue of controlled minds. Bureaucrats bragged about reducing rebellion without bloodshed, as though mercy were measured by paperwork. In the streets, cruelty became spectacle. Captive queens paraded through the forum beneath arches carved with eagles, their chains polished to gold. Children climbed statues to see better. Mothers pointed and whispered moral lessons. Poets composed verses about the art of transformation, praising how Rome could turn proud rulers into silent ornaments of peace. It was theater, a civilization applauding its own inhumanity. And the citizens loved it. Each parade ended not in screams, but applause. The senators watched from marble balconies, wine cups in hand, nodding in approval as dancers reenacted the submission of nations. Rome had made cruelty beautiful, the ugliness of power dressed in ceremony and rhythm. From the outside, the empire appeared stable, enlightened, divine. But beneath the gilded surface, something monstrous pulsed, a collective heartbeat trained to beat in unison. By perfecting control, Rome had made itself godlike. But in doing so, it had replaced the divine with the mechanical. The empire no longer conquered bodies. It conquered belief. Rome's cruelty was never chaotic, it was organized, precise, elegant. Behind every broken queen stood an empire of paper and pen. The empire had built its most terrifying creation, not on battlefields, but in offices. Dozens of marble chambers filled with scribes, administrators, and engineers, the quiet machinery of suffering. Each captive passed through the same sequence: Department of Intelligence, Department of Logistics, Department of Cultural Affairs, Department of Personnel, Department of Urban Planning. 47 officials in total, each responsible for a single task, each blind to the whole. The system was perfect because it divided responsibility until it vanished. The guard believed he was simply transporting a prisoner. The scribe believed he was merely keeping records. The servant believed she was offering comfort. Together, they formed the first true machine of bureaucratic inhumanity. Every cruelty had a clerk. Every degradation had a ledger. Every scream became a statistic. And the empire rewarded efficiency. Promotions were given not for courage, but for compliance. A faster psychological collapse meant higher pay. A new manipulation technique could earn a lifetime pension. Each year, the emperor himself hosted the ceremony of behavioral excellence, a gala where men who perfected obedience received golden laurel crowns. They called it progress. In one fresco found centuries later, a Roman artist depicted the chain of duty, dozens of officials, each handing a scroll to the next, their faces expressionless, their hands spotless, while beneath their feet, faint shadows of chained figures writhe in silence. That was the genius of Rome, they had found a way to make cruelty invisible even to its participants. Senators toasted the empire's peace. Philosophers praised its discipline. No one realized that peace was simply the absence of resistance, and resistance had been scientifically erased. Inside one of those marble offices, a clerk paused while writing a report on Subject A17, Cartimandua. His stylus hovered above the wax tablet. He hesitated. Just for a moment, he wondered if she was still a person. Then his supervisor walked by, nodding approvingly. The clerk straightened, erased the thought, and wrote. Compliance complete. Recommend replication of process across northern provinces. And just like that, the machine continued, efficient, silent, unstoppable. Rome had achieved what no empire before it dared to dream. They had turned cruelty into policy, and obedience into art. The empire no longer needed monsters. It had employees. For centuries, the system had worked like divine clockwork, flawless, efficient, unquestioned. But every machine, no matter how perfect, eventually turns upon its creator. It happened in 193 CE, the year of the 5 emperors, a year soaked in betrayal, assassinations, and civil war. As rival generals clawed for the throne, the same psychological machinery once used to tame foreign queens was quietly redirected inward. The empire that had spent generations breaking the minds of others finally turned its tools upon its own blood. The wives and daughters of senators were the first. Accused of disloyalty, they were seized under the same policies once reserved for conquered royalty. The streets of Rome, once used to parades of foreign captives, now bore the weight of Roman women in chains. When the procession entered the Forum, the city did not cheer. It gasped. The familiar faces, women of noble birth, daughters of consuls, sisters of generals, passed through the same arch where barbarian queens once stood. The people who had once thrown petals now stood frozen in horror. The air was thick with the realization that the empire's cruelty had come home. The guards still marched in perfect rhythm. The scribes still took notes. The banners still waved proudly. But something had changed in the crowd. The Romans saw not triumph, but a mirror. Among the captives was Livia Drusilla, wife of Senator Gaius Antonius. She had once applauded these parades, calling them proof of Rome's greatness. Now she walked barefoot through the same square, her silk torn, her hair shorn to the scalp. Her husband watched from a balcony, unable to speak. The empire had made him a spectator to his own wife's destruction. And for the first time in generations, the silence of the Forum was not reverence, it was shame. The system that had erased compassion in others now erased it in itself. Clerks continued filing reports. Awards were still issued for efficiency. But something within the empire cracked. Senators whispered that the gods had abandoned them. Priests reported omens, the statues of the goddesses weeping blood, the temple of Concord struck by lightning. Rome had conquered the world, but it had forgotten why. Now, beneath its marble perfection, it devoured itself, a serpent consuming its own tail, feeding on the very obedience it once demanded. The empire that once prided itself on taming the human soul finally discovered what it felt like to lose its own. The flames that consumed Rome's archives did not destroy its knowledge, they liberated it. The scrolls turned to ash, but the ideas within them drifted like smoke, seeping into every civilization that followed. The empire's walls collapsed, its temples fell, its emperors turned to dust, yet the system survived. The methods that once broke queens in marble chambers found new names, new languages, new technologies. The Romans had written a blueprint for obedience so perfect it no longer required an empire. It only needed ambition. Centuries later, Nazi psychologists conducted experiments under the banner of science, documenting pain with the same sterile precision as Roman scribes. The language changed, but the logic remained: to control the human mind, you must measure it first. Every test, every file, every numbered victim, echoes of dignitas destituta. In the Soviet era, interrogators refined what Rome had begun. They no longer needed whips or chains. Instead, they used silence, isolation, and scripted confession, psychological blueprints perfected in Roman villas centuries before. The reports even used the same phrasing: behavioral correction, integration success rate, compliance through re-education. And then came the modern age, the sleek, polished empire of the invisible. No legions. No generals. No emperors. Only systems. Algorithms instead of decrees. Screens instead of scrolls. Now the chains are made of choice. Corporations manipulate desire, not freedom. They reward obedience with comfort, disguise control as convenience, and isolate dissent by drowning it in noise. Social media curates opinions the same way Roman scribes curated behavior, through constant observation, subtle correction, and engineered illusion. Rome's ghost has become digital. It whispers in boardrooms, in laboratories, in the glow of every blue screen. The same empire that once studied how to break a queen now studies how to shape a consumer, a voter, a believer. The methods endured because they were efficient. And efficiency, in every age, has always outweighed empathy. What began as an experiment in subjugation became the foundation of civilization's progress. The torch of Rome still burns, not in temples or armies, but in the quiet architecture of control that defines the modern world. We no longer build marble prisons. We build invisible ones, gilded, comfortable, celebrated as freedom. The Roman eagle no longer spreads its wings over continents. It hovers, unseen, over minds. Rome believed it had perfected domination. Every queen silenced, every rebellion measured, every thought catalogued, the empire's triumph over the human mind seemed absolute. But beneath the marble calm of its villas, something ancient refused to die. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered faint etchings beneath the plaster of those same walls, tiny marks carved with fragments of bone, scraps of metal, or fingernails worn to blood. They were not words of submission. They were prayers. Celtic runes for freedom. Germanic sigils for defiance. Egyptian hymns written backward to hide their meaning. Songs that no one was meant to hear again. The empire had taken their names, their voices, their gods. But in these secret inscriptions, the queens whispered through time, "We endured." One fragment, found beneath the ruins of a Roman villa in Britannia, carried a name burned into legend: Cartimandua. Her handwriting, recorded by a Roman scribe shortly before her death, bore a final note. "You can own my silence, but not my thoughts." It was not rebellion in the physical sense. It was something greater, proof that the machinery of obedience could wound the flesh, but not extinguish the self. Historians would later call it the failure point. The moment where control reached its limit. Because Rome's system, for all its brilliance, depended on the illusion that obedience was eternal. It never understood that submission is borrowed, not bought. Over time, the empire that built its power on the study of human minds collapsed beneath the weight of its own perfection. Bureaucrats began distrusting one another. Scholars manipulated reports to protect themselves. The system of observation turned inward until Rome devoured itself, a mirror reflecting only madness. The same techniques that once silenced queens now silenced senators. The same surveillance meant to control enemies now monitored its own citizens. And in that echo chamber of paranoia, the empire broke. But the whispers endured. They traveled in folklore, in the rhythm of tribal songs, in the quiet faith of women who refused to kneel. They became myths, then stories, then histories, and finally, warnings. Rome fell not because of rebellion, but because of conscience. The conscience it had tried so hard to erase. And so the lesson remains, carved into the ruins and remembered in silence. Empires rise by mastering fear, but they die the moment they forget that no chain, no policy, no empire, can ever own the human spirit.